Okay, hi there everyone, and welcome to today's University Business Web Seminar. My name is Kurt Isley-Durley. I'm the Web Seminar Editor here at UB, and I'll be your moderator. The title of our event, as you see here, is Protect Your Campus with a Zero Trust Cybersecurity Approach, and is being brought to you through the generous support of our sponsor for today, Microsoft. First off, as members of our audience are still coming in here, a bit of background about our topic we'll be taking a look at here today. Today's colleges and universities require a cybersecurity model that embraces mobile-heavy user behavior and protects its people, data, devices, and applications no matter where they are located. A zero trust approach meets these needs by evaluating and granting access to users and devices both inside and outside of the campus environment based on levels of potential risk. Today we'll be learning about how to implement a zero trust cybersecurity approach at any institution. We're looking forward to an interesting presentation and discussion here. Plus Q&A, we welcome your questions, so feel free to ask them at any time. But stay tuned, we're going to get started in just a minute or two here. First though, just some quick housekeeping. First item, as it says here, for tech support, if you need help at any time, you can use the chat panel that you should see at the right side of your screen there. If you don't see that, you may have to activate that panel by clicking the chat button at the bottom of the screen there. Just send a message to our host and producer. His name is Jason York. Let him know if you're having any technical issues. He'll be able to help you out there. Also, second item here, if you have any trouble with your audio at any time, or if you prefer to listen over the phone, we will post the phone number and access code in that chat panel at the right there. You can dial those at any time to get audio access over the phone. As I said earlier, we welcome your questions at any time. If you have questions for our panelists, feel free to enter them in the Q&A at the bottom right-hand corner there. Not the chat window, but the Q&A, and make sure it's set to all panelists, like it says on the slide here. We'll answer as many as we can when we get to the Q&A at the end of the presentation here. So once again, if you have a question, feel free to type it at any time in that Q&A bottom right-hand corner, and we'll address those at the end. Also, speaking of questions, as the last item on the slide says, we're commonly asked about accessing this presentation later on, either the slides or the archive recording. And yes, we will be making both of those available to you. You'll be receiving a follow-up email with links to where you can find the slides and the archive recording, which we will be hosting on the UB site. So if you want to go back over the presentation, if you want to share with anyone on your team, at your institution, any of your colleagues, you'll have ample opportunity to do that, so don't worry about that. Okay, so with that, on to our program. Our two panelists today, we're fortunate to have with us. Sam Buckhalter is Security and Compliance Technical Specialist at Microsoft. We're also joined by Chris Irwin. He's Partner and CTO at Foresight IT Solutions. Chris from Foresight is going to start us off here, and then we'll get to Sam to learn more about Zero Trust. So with introduction here, I'll hand it over to him at this point. Chris, it's great to have you. Welcome to today's webinar.
Thank you, Kurt. I appreciate it very much. Guys, I think we've got some great content in store. I'm going to go ahead and get us kicked off, and then I'm going to hand it over to Sam, who's going to dig in on a little bit of the technical end. So first thing I wanted to cover, it really is, what is Zero Trust? Before we can really understand what Zero Trust is, we really need to understand what Zero Trust isn't. Zero Trust isn't a literal, right? You can't build and manage a practical strategy around absolutes. Security is constantly changing. The variables are too complex, and you can't just set a monolithic path and follow it. It isn't an adjective. You aren't going to be Zero Trust. It's a very fluid state, and it's a journey to get there. It's not a product. There is no such thing as Zero Trust technology. There's lots of products and solutions that will help you get to a Zero Trust state, but there's no single solution. And it's not a revolution. What you really need to do as we go through this is build on top of what you already have. You have investments in current technologies, whether those be firewalls, VPNs, etc., and we're going to build on that. We're going to enhance that. Really, what zero trust is a mindset. And what we want to do is think, we approach every situation. It means everything's open to the internet. We don't want to trust any single source. We want to employ multi-factor authentication when available. We want to focus on breach containment, assuming there is already a breach, and understand that there aren't enough people. What does that mean? Automation is key. Everybody's understaffed. The number of devices that we're dealing with, the number of signals that we're seeing, the applications that we're having to deal with is rising exponentially in this environment where we've got BYOD. You're in a university space. We've got distance learning, and so our student population has expanded exponentially now. We've got to focus on automation and doing an automated detection and remediation response to really try and get into that zero trust mindset. So to take you a little deeper into that, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to turn it over to Sam. Sam, please feel free to take it away.
Thank you very much, Chris. I appreciate that. And I'm going to share out here. Take it over. Is everyone able to see the screen all right?
Yes, looks great, Sam. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. All right. So before we dive into zero trust, I like to take a step back and look at the old world a little bit and how we've defined our security perimeters. You go back maybe 20, 30 years ago, IT was really taking off, and your security perimeter was that physical building. You had to be on site on that network, and it was pretty safe to assume if you weren't on site sitting at your desk, you weren't going to have access to any resources for that network or that organization. That kind of evolved. Workers were more mobile. We start looking at the VPN world, where you're effectively creating that, you're using that same physical network perimeter, but expanding that virtually into a remote workforce. You're able to poke holes and allow people avenues to pretend or effectively operate like they are at that physical level inside that network. And that creates a lot of problems. You've got the president or someone that's traveling and it's a VIP that has lost a phone or device, and they make that call and ask for a pinhole to be opened up in that VPN so that they can get back to their job with their replacement that they've had to pick up while traveling. And those pinholes are often overlooked and never gone back and blocked after the fact. And very often leveraged by attackers to get in. And now an attacker that has compromised your VPN effectively has free reign in the network to cause havoc and move laterally inside that environment. So that's kind of how we've looked in the past. The challenges of IT today are drastically changing. And so at Microsoft, we believe identity is now the center of that modern approach to security. And so we want to be able to help you address that explosion of apps and all the challenges you have today, the drastic increase of identity attacks. I'm sure phishing campaigns are a big problem for everyone out there. We want to make sure that you're able to keep up with the ever-evolving data privacy and regulations and the GDPRs and the different policies you have to comply with going forward, as well as provide your end users that demand for increased modernization, increased flexibility on where they work from and how. So always a couple fun facts I like to bring up real quick. As you're probably very familiar, most of the hacking breaches, they're stolen or weak passwords, and that's where those phishing campaigns really come into play. Interesting fact, even at Microsoft, we've transitioned how we handle our password policies. So we used to have a policy that required us to change our passwords once a quarter, and we've expanded that to about once a year now. Because what would happen is when you're changing your passwords too frequently, you're really just using the same password. At least the vast majority of people use the same password and append a number to the end, and then count that number up over time, just for the sake of being easy to remember. So we've shifted our mentality there. We require a once a year password change, and then leverage all of the other security features built into our stack to help protect our users, whether it's MFA or location restrictions, or just user sign-in risk. And then the other fun fact is about 80% of employees are using those non-approved apps for work. It's getting a handle around the shadow IT. What apps are out there, what apps are requesting permissions of your resources, and being able to identify where gaps may lie. So as we dive into zero trust, we're shifting our mentality. We're no longer looking at the physical network perimeter as that security boundary. That's an outdated methodology. We're looking at, we're shifting our thinking into logical constraints. What cloud apps do we have? And as well as on-premises apps. How do we need to protect those? What category do they fall in? Are they high-risk apps, or if that content or that access is granted incorrectly, what's the value of that data and that information to your organization versus the low-quality apps? Maybe you want to be a little bit more lenient on where people access their email from, just for the flexibility and the ease of getting your job done. We're looking at the integration and collaboration between different organizations. So you don't just have your employees or your students or your faculty. You're looking at other schools and other organizations that you partner with and being able to provide them access to resources, but still do that fluidly and securely. We're looking at the vast number of devices people want to connect from, whether it's a device your school is issued out to them, or if they're connecting them from their personal device, their iPads or various devices that they're wanting to leverage to connect in and have an effective experience. And then lastly, we're also looking at the on-premises, those legacy apps, and creating a boundary and being able to control them in a similar fashion that you are with your modern cloud apps. Second part to that is assume every resource on the internet is on the open internet. We're treating a user the same whether they're on your corporate network as you would be if they were coming from Starbucks. We're still looking at the identity, that device they're coming from, what location, and more importantly, what workload they're accessing and the value of that and the experience you want to give them into that workload. But effectively, there is no safe place. So we want to treat everything like it's on the open internet. And lastly, we're looking at never trust, always verify. We're never trusting the default elements of an environment. So you're not going to trust by default that network they're on. Where does this user logging in with? What are their normal behavior patterns? Do they normally log in from Colorado, and all of a sudden you're seeing logins coming from France or South America? What is their normal behavior? What devices are they coming from? Is that device trusted? Is it a personal device? Is it a web-based experience they're coming in from? And how you handle each of those different scenarios. So we're always verifying and providing them the experience and the security mechanisms that are necessary for that specific session, wherever that may be. So this is an old slide I used to like to present quite a bit. It gives you a great layout of the Microsoft world, and it ends at that. It's the Microsoft world here. So you've got your on-premise Active Directory domains. It's connected and synchronized into Azure AD with Azure AD Connect. We've got our various authentication mechanisms there that tie into the Microsoft cloud, whether it's Office 365 and the underlying services, Intune, Dynamics, Azure, etc. That doesn't cut it these days, though. The world is much bigger than Microsoft. And so where this comes into play is Microsoft single sign-on supports third-party apps. That's often overlooked. I mean, you can connect in your G Suites, your Boxes, Dropboxes, Workday, Salesforce. This number is a little outdated. We're actually well over 1 million apps integrated directly into Azure Active Directory. And that could be a combination of natively supported apps that are in our app store. It's a combination of custom and on-premises apps that are connected in with our Azure App Proxy, or any other really SaaS, SAML, OAuth applications you can connect in that might not be natively published. So you can connect in those third-party apps, leverage the same zero trust mentality and all of the security functions that you use for Office 365 and Microsoft workloads into that third parties as well, because that's mandatory these days. Ultimately, we want to provide one common identity for all single sign-on. You want to be able to give users the access to all of the apps they need, first party and third party, and you want to be able to retire things like VPNs, give users access to on-premises apps, and provide the same level of cloud security into on-premises legacy apps, so that they are secured and you have the same control of those as you do with your cloud apps. So getting into the Microsoft Zero Trust solution. So as we're talking about the Zero Trust framework, we really need to connect everything to a policy engine. Most notably, we'll talk a little bit about conditional access here, but that security and compliance policy engine is really the core of allowing us to have that Zero Trust solution and protect the Microsoft cloud, be able to protect your third-party other cloud SaaS apps, and again, your on-premises legacy apps and web apps too. So first part of that going in is your users. We're looking at different risk factors here, whether it's a risk of that user or a potential risk for that specific session if they're coming from different locations that are not normal. Does that user have access to that resource? Are they part of a group or a role that denies them or requires additional security mechanisms, such as MFA, to be able to get into that application? Where is that identity risky? We're looking at both Azure AD as well as on-premises Active Directory with Azure ATP, Advanced Threat Protection, to get that full picture of that user risk and what we want to allow them to connect to. We're bringing in components from the device too. Is that managed by your organization? Is it healthy? Is it compliant? And being able to change that status on the fly. If we detected with Microsoft Defender that a threat has emerged on that device, and subsequently, do you want to revoke access to certain applications until that threat is taken care of, and then automatically reinstate that access once that remediation occurs? So we've got Microsoft Defender ATP is your endpoint detection and response solution there, and then Microsoft Intune as your device management component. On the other side of that, we've got Microsoft Information Protection. This is how we're protecting your data in various scenarios, how you're classifying and providing access to content for sensitive data types. And then Microsoft Cloud App Security, that's our CASB solution, Cloud Access Security Broker. And this is governing and giving insight into how users are using your cloud apps, what content's out there, what restrictions you might want to put in place over those cloud apps. Maybe in certain scenarios you want to block them from downloading data or monitor actions depending on their risk factor and where they're coming from. And then, of course, Azure Sentinel. That's somewhat new. In the last year, we've announced that that's our cloud-based SIEM solution for consolidating all of those logs and information to a SIEM. So I'll start off here, look at a few of the key components. So first off, we're looking at users and session risk. And so one of the big components we have to identify here is the Azure AD identity protection. This is our insight. Microsoft works and looks for your leaked credentials, things that might be available on the dark web, in order to identify risk. If those credentials have been for sale, we're going to increase that risk score. And ultimately, you can take action on that to block access to your content. So if there's risk that Microsoft has deemed from our analysis, our research in the web, mixing that with risks you identified and user behaviors. Where do they normally come from? What machines do they usually connect in? We can calculate and pull that together and give a risk score to that session and take the appropriate actions. A couple best practices, generally medium risk or above, or really below. Medium risk and below, you would require MFA. High risk, probably want to start blocking logins and requiring a password change. We'll tie that in with MFA. So you have the ability with conditional access to choose where you want to have MFA come from. Maybe if you are on that university network, you might not require MFA, or maybe you combine it with things like device. So if you've got a managed device that's in a healthy state on your university network, you can bypass MFA and let people connect and get their jobs done in an easier fashion without being disrupted with MFA prompts. In other scenarios, if they're off the network, maybe you allow them to connect, but you're going to require MFA from a personal device, for example. And then we've got our device compliancy here. We're able to pull in different information. Again, things like Microsoft Defender ATP. We're able to detect those threats real time and change that level of access to your corporate resources based on active threats going on the machine. We can pause access to your cloud apps if there's a threat that's been detected as the remediation efforts are going forth. It keeps your resources from being compromised. And once that threat is remediated, you can restore that access. So device compliancy is a big component. All that revolves around conditional access. So conditional access is where you can create those policies and based on the different signals that are coming in, that user risk, the devices, the device status, network location, etc., you can make that decision on what policies you want to implement there and how you want to enforce those across your resources. A couple call-outs I wanted to make is this works both with Azure Active Directory, so your users and your students, your faculty, as well as what we call Azure B2B. So Azure B2B is effectively your guests or external people you've invited to collaborate in your environment. You can have separate policies for both resources on how you want to secure your resources from different scenarios. And then I'm going to dive into Azure App Proxy a little bit. So Azure App Proxy is a way to connect in and have all these same controls on your legacy on-premises applications. So it's a lightweight proxy you can deploy on-premises and then publish legacy apps into Azure Active Directory and treat them like everything else, all of your other SaaS apps, and still the same restrictions. You can put MFA in front of it and maintain that security and not have to open up a VPN per se. So you can publish those apps via the proxy. They can connect to it from the same cloud security mechanisms without having to VPN to your corporate network. Oops, got ahead of myself. And then the last component I wanted to talk about is our conditional access app control. And so you can take, whether it's a native SaaS app or a Microsoft app, or one of your on-premises apps from App Proxy, and pipe that through our conditional access app control. And this is our part of our Microsoft Cloud App Security on how you proxy access to applications. So if you're in a riskier environment, maybe you have a user connecting from home into an HR app, but they're not connected from a corporate device, you might let them go into that app and that session, but you're going to restrict their access and monitor what they're doing a little bit closer. So you might want to restrict their access to download if you're not all out blocking their access from that scenario. But conditional access app control is what allows you to restrict things like downloads of files in certain scenarios so that you don't have data leaving your environment. And so with that, I'm going to actually pass it back to Chris to talk a little bit more about various university scenarios and how different universities have implemented this methodology into their environment.
Awesome, Sam. Appreciate it. So I've got a couple of different use cases here. We just kind of lay it out on the slide. This first use case was a large university system we're working with. They're essentially looking to build out a centralized Azure environment to provide hosting and shared services as well as increased collaboration between the schools. So, they've got a number of SaaS applications. They've got some legacy applications that today, in the traditional model that Sam was just mentioning, they're having to create identities. They're having to manage accounts in their on-premise Active Directory or an open LDAP system or something, and they own that entire identity lifecycle management. They've got to deal with, firewall rules, VPNs, et cetera, to provide those services to the other organizations in the system. The model that we've put forth and we're finishing up implementation on now is utilizing Azure with a zero trust mindset. So essentially, taking Azure B2B accounts, which Sam mentioned briefly there, so we can have these guest accounts in their Azure tenant that are actually authenticating back to an external tenant, whether that be another Azure Active Directory, Google tenant, et cetera. Doesn't have to be another Microsoft tenant, and that's the beauty of this. We could take those accounts and we can give them access to resources in this shared tenant. So now all of the single sign-on applications that they've got hosted natively in Azure, whether those be SAML applications linked back to an existing IDP, or even Azure Application Proxy to light up those legacy on-premise applications, we have the ability to provide that level of access to these individual organizations without the central IT having to own the identity. Now I don't have to manage and maintain hundreds of thousands of accounts, deal with password lockouts and all of the headache that comes along with that. Because we're using the zero trust mindset and I've got those applications authenticating through Azure Active Directory now, it's very easy for me to tie in conditional access controls. I can pick and choose the applications similar to what Sam was just speaking about, and I can lock down those applications based on the user's level of access, where they're accessing from, what device they're coming in from, etc. Because this is a shared environment, this particular customer wanted to implement just-in-time access, and so we're taking advantage of Azure's privileged identity management solution to do that. So we, instead of folks having a traditional always elevated role in the environment, what we've done is segment that off. There are members from the various organizations that will have delegated access to certain components of this, and they go and essentially check out these rights. So when a user needs, or when an administrator needs to go in and make a modification, add an application, etc., they can go check that right out. They've got an audit trail. They're only elevated for a certain period of time, and then then it's automatically removed. And finally, tying it all together, we're utilizing the MCAS solution, so Microsoft's BCAS or CASB broker, to assist on the security end of it. It's helping us identify where users are logging in from, where when accounts potentially have been breached, we're tying that back into Azure Identity Protection to look for those accounts that have been sold on the dark web, etc. And so we can more quickly identify and automate the processing of that information. So if there is a compromised account, we're able to help them identify it quicker than they would and lock the environment down in a much quicker manner. So that's one scenario we're dealing with today, and we've had great success around that type of model. Another scenario is a mid-sized school, 18,000 plus students. They've got a fast-growing distance learning program. We've seen this a lot at multiple organizations now. They're really widening their net. They're bringing in students from all over the country, and that's brought a whole lot of challenges. The traditional methods of managing that just don't work when you've got a bunch of remote users now that aren't on devices that you own. You're going to see similar technology here, and how we approach it. It's a similar list, right? It's Azure Single Sign-On for the SaaS applications. It's Azure Application Proxy for the legacy applications, conditional access with multi-factor authentication, Azure Identity Protection. But the way that we go about this is in a slightly different manner. It's a small IT staff. They've got 18,000 full-time students on campus, but probably 3 times that in the distance learning program. They've constantly got folks coming in and out. They're part of a larger system, so there's some transition from other various schools. You may come over here and take a class or something along those lines during the summer. And so we really had to focus on automation and how do we provide access to these single sign-on applications, these legacy apps, in a secure and automated manner. And so we drive a lot of that through their identity system on premise by simple group management. And we call this, zero-day productivity. So by looking at the by looking at the data coming in on the users, we can dynamically put them in the correct groups. Those groups in Azure Active Directory provide access to the single sign-on applications. And then we put conditional access policies around those applications to lock down the identities, to enforce multi-factor authentication if they're not on the trusted network. So it gives them the ability, using MFA coupled with conditional access, to avoid probably the biggest detractor we get from employees and students is authentication fatigue. People are used to MFA. Facebook does it, Google does it, Twitter, etc. So they're used to the concept, but they don't want to have a second factor of authentication for everything. And so we've got to learn to walk that line. And by tying that second factor of authentication, by marrying the need for security with the desire for ease of access and these conditional access policies, it allows us to pick and choose when we enforce that. If you're on a trusted network, maybe we give you access to the system without a two-factor authentication. The minute you pick up your laptop and go to Starbucks and you try and log in, you get hit up for that second factor of authentication. So it's a nice happy medium. It gives this organization the ability to scale out in an automated fashion, and we've had great success with this model at multiple organizations. And the final one I want to discuss is slightly different. I won't say this is a niche, but in education, we've run into multiple teaching medical universities that have hospitals associated with them. This was an interesting use case, and I've seen this similar concept both in education and in the healthcare space. It's a university with a hospital. We were working specifically with the hospital, and the hospital is providing access to some medical software and collaborative access with a host of local clinics and doctors' offices. And so the challenge there is, how do they provide virtualized desktops to these small one-off doctors' offices without creating them accounts, and how do you manage that? And so the tactic that we took with these folks was to use Azure Active Directory as the source for those accounts, to tap into Windows Virtual Desktop to provide the VDI access to all these various medical applications, whether those be Epic or Cerner or what have you. Because it's in Azure, Windows Virtual Desktop natively has the ability to take advantage of conditional access policies. So again, even when they're trying to hit that virtual desktop, we can enforce where they actually access that from. This was a huge deal for these guys. They're dealing with HIPAA data, and when it's in the cloud, you can log in from anywhere, anytime in most instances. So we had to be very careful that these individuals didn't go to Starbucks and pull open an ERM application. So being able to take advantage of the inherent security built into the Azure platform, tie into trusted networks, and enforce that with the conditional access policy, even at these small remote sites, gave us the ability to lock down that data to protect the user data and the system itself, while still giving these campus or these small clinics the ability to access what they needed. These particular individuals took it a step further. They were utilizing Azure ATP. So Azure ATP provides machine learning on your on-premise Active Directory. It essentially captures the data, pushes it up into Azure, and has a giant machine learning engine on the back of it. Similar to what happens in Azure AD. so we can find, lateral movement in the Active Directory environment, et cetera. And this was important for these guys because they're giving access to on-prem resources to, users that aren't necessarily directly employed by the hospital or the university. So we needed to be able to keep a close eye on those accounts. Azure ATP was a great way to do that. We couple that with MCAS. Again, for the cloud app security components, there are direct hooks between MCAS and Azure ATP where they can cross-feed data in. And that's the beauty of the Microsoft ecosystem. It's not just about a point solution. It's about being able to share that data between the various systems and having them communicate with each other. And then the final component was Defender ATP. Defender ATP was more targeted at the hospital users versus the individual clinicians because they didn't own those devices necessarily. Aside from Defender ATP being great from an endpoint management standpoint, the reason these guys were targeting it was for shadow IT. This is huge in a more lockdown environment. You don't know necessarily when someone in the billing department has swiped a credit card and gone and signed up for Box, and they could be sharing God knows what. Beautiful part about Defender ATP is because it runs on the endpoint, it's built into the Windows 10 OS. There are clients if you're using other OSs, but if it's in Windows 10, it's baked in. All of that telemetry data can be pushed up. And directly in MCAS, there is a cloud discovery dashboard that gets real-time populated from all of your Windows 10 endpoints, from everything that's running Defender ATP. And so these guys were very easily able to find out exactly what applications are being run on these desktops. If someone in the finance department or in the billing department or any other department went and swiped a credit card and signed up for a service, they'll be able to go pull a report on it. They can identify those applications, they can sanction those applications or unsanction them, and have the solution automate responses based off of that. So it was very, very powerful for these guys to be able to provide services at scale. Very rarely are IT budgets going up. Typically, they're going the other direction. Generally speaking, we're understaffed. And so being able to automate that and really provide security around this disparate environment was key to success for these guys. This is a model that we've seen utilized at multiple customers. The medical hospital was an interesting use case, but we've seen that done at multiple places, and it's worked out really, really well so far. So as far as the use cases go, happy to talk about other experiences and stuff we've run into, but that's really all I have from a use case perspective. But I do want to touch on a couple of key takeaways, strategies. And Sam kind of mentioned this, right? We want to try and make the move away from passwords. That's not going to happen. If we would be realistic, that's not going to happen in the very near future. We can augment that with multi-factor authentication, and that's number 2 on here. I mean, you should absolutely do that. But there are technologies out there. FIDO2 keys, biometrics. Windows Hello is a great option for biometrics. Microsoft has a fairly slick passwordless authentication solution. We use it internally. I love it. Can provide a very seamless access experience for a lot of individuals, and it's much more secure than a traditional username and password. MFA, if you don't have MFA, you need to get MFA, you need to turn it on. It's going to absolutely help you out. It won't fix all of your problems, but it will definitely help out. And I will throw in here, probably the biggest source of phishing that we see is people with basic auth still turned on. If you get rid of basic auth and enforce MFA, you will still get phishing emails, don't get me wrong, but the users that get taken advantage of will go down significantly. As I mentioned earlier, conditional access is a great way to reduce authentication fatigue. One of the biggest drawbacks, particularly in a university space, is if you tell a teacher that all of a sudden they're going to have to perform a second factor of authentication every single day. Nothing turns a crown. They'll bring out the torches and pitchforks really, really quick. So being able to control that and limit when they have to do it and provide some conditions around that can really help the story. Third is use MCAS to monitor your solutions. MCAS is a great tool. Not only for Microsoft, it connects with a variety of third-party apps, Box, Google, ServiceNow. It'll hook into your SIEM, can provide a whole host of data. I mentioned the interconnections with Defender ATP. If you don't have Defender ATP rolled out, or you've got another solution in place, that's fine. You can still feed it your firewall logs, etc., and get a very similar report. It's going to be a snapshot. It's not as real time or robust as the Defender report would be, because there's just not as much data in there, but can still be very, very valuable for ferreting out shadow IT, seeing what's actually running in your environment that you don't know about it. And that really covers number 4 as well. But MCAS is a phenomenal solution. There's also a whole host of automation functionalities built into MCAS, and it'll tie right back into your SIEM as well. So as far as my part of the presentation, I'm more than happy to answer questions, but that's really all I had to cover from a slide standpoint.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris and Sam. Really appreciate you guys sharing your expertise with us here. Yes, we just had this concluding slide before we get to the Q&A here. If you're interested in learning more, Chris Irwin, again, is with Foresight IT Solutions. You can contact them here at this email address or the phone number if you're interested in learning more about how you can use this at your institution. But if you have questions for now's your chance. Just a couple quick reminders. I know Sam and Chris had to cover a lot of ground there in a short amount of time. So if you would like to go over the presentation, we will be making it available. Both the slide deck, the slides that you can go back over, or the recording. So if you want to share with your colleagues, go back over it. You'll be able to do that at your own pace. Another quick reminder here, if you do have any questions for Sam or Chris, both of them very experienced with this zero trust approach in higher education, feel free to enter your questions in the Q&A bottom right-hand corner, and we appreciate your participation here. Let's see, first question for you, Sam. It says, we have Duo MFA today. How can we make that transition easy as possible?
Perfect. Excellent question. So conditional access in Azure AD does support both Azure MFA and Duo MFA. It's a very quick 5-minute setup initially, and then from there, when you're building your policies, it's literally a checkbox. You can select Duo or Azure MFA, or if you really want to inflict some pain, you can select them both and have people MFAing multiple times.
Okay, great. Chris, you said, I think, in your introduction, just talking about zero trust overall, that it's more of a mindset than anything else, I think is what you said. Is that a challenge for institutions that you've seen, changing that, the mindset?
I think it absolutely is, and a lot of it depends on, you get people that are ingrained in doing things a certain way, and being able to kind of think out of the box and get past the traditional 4 walls. We had a great conversation not long ago with an admin that said, yeah, I can do this on my firewall, right? We were talking about catching, malware attachments coming in and using Office ATP and SafeLinks. And he's right. If you're sitting in the building, then that works great. But the reality of today's environment is that the vast majority of people they're not in the office all the time. They're at home checking email. They're on the plane checking email. They may never come to the office, and so those traditional solutions just don't cut it anymore. And what the point that I was trying to make to him is, yeah, you're right. If I'm sitting on my desk, then what you're telling me is absolutely true. But the minute I leave this office and I go somewhere else and I hop on my cell phone and check it, I'm exposed. And I've got company data on my device, and now that's at risk. And so utilizing the zero trust model and some of these cloud-based solutions and really trying to lock down the identity provides me extensive protection. Now when I try and click on a link that goes to malware because it's run through Office ATP, it doesn't matter whether I access it from a cell phone or a tablet or a kiosk somewhere. It's all being protected because it's linked back to my identity and my organization, and I'm not forced to be behind a firewall any longer. It's protection everywhere. And to your point, Kurt, it really is a mindset and getting people to kind of think outside of the box, and the traditional constructs still apply. Build on top of that, though. Understand your user base, where they're accessing data from, and how do you protect them when they're not behind your wall.
Sure. Yeah, and that's a great lead into a follow-up question about how much of that mindset change or communication is with your users at an institution as opposed to your IT staff and
I
faculty.
think it's less so for the users. Everybody's got a phone today, right? Everybody's used to. I spoke about MFA briefly. People are used to multi-factor authentication. Social media does it all the time. If someone tries to log into my Google account too many times, I get a multi-factor auth request, right? So they've been trained by these services that they're going to do willingly. That's a requirement. So I don't think you get the staff so much. It's when you force them to do it all the time, and all of a sudden it's an inconvenience that they start to complain. It's really the IT folks, and I think a lot of times we tend to overthink. There are definitely some scenarios where end users are much more willing to do something than we would expect them to be. And then there's other scenarios where we as IT folks don't think it's that big of a deal, and they they get up in arms over it.
Right, sure, sure. Uh, Another question for you, Sam, says you mentioned blocking basic authentication. How do you recommend we start that process?
That's a great question. So Microsoft provides a handful of what we call baseline policies. And the great thing here is they are completely complementary regardless of what licensing level you're at. So you can go get your introduction into conditional access and review those policies and enable them where you see fit. One of which is a policy to block basic authentication or legacy authentication. Another one I highly recommend is a policy to require MFA for all of your admins. So again, regardless of what licensing you're at, you can go turn that on, and it'll require MFA for anyone with administrative permissions inside of Microsoft 365.
And I'd build on top of that. If you happen to have A5, you should absolutely look at privileged identity management for those accounts. And even if you don't have A5 tenant wide, you should look at getting it at least for the administrators. Having the ability, to make administrators go and check those credentials out and provide that just-in-time access and audit trail significantly reduces your available attack surface.
Okay, sure. Uh, Another question for you, Chris. I believe it's for you. It says, how does Azure provide support for legacy applications?
Okay, yeah, so the app proxy stuff. So this is something that a lot of folks aren't aware of necessarily. They typically think Azure SSO and SaaS applications, Box, Workday, Concur, etc. Virtually any application that you host on premise, if it's doing Windows integrated authentication, forms-based auth, etc., you can actually proxy that through Azure. The beautiful part about this is the application has no clue that it's being proxied through Azure, but by doing so, you can leverage the security features in Azure. You can take advantage of conditional access because it's an SSO app in Azure now. We can tie multi-factor authentication to it, all the telemetry that's coming through MCAS and stuff. And it's very simple. There's a lightweight proxy application that you install. It's essentially a reverse proxy that you install in your on-premise environment that gets registered with Azure, and then you publish the application. Depending on the authentication method, like for a Windows integrated authentication, you configure Kerberos constrained delegation. It does require the user to still have an on-premise AD account. So if you're using B2B accounts in that particular example, you want to provide a legacy act or access to a legacy application to some guest users, can absolutely be done. You just need to manage those accounts in your on-premise AD so we can do the constrained delegation. But from an end user perspective, they hit it through Azure just like they would any other SaaS app, and life is good, and you get to add additional security to those legacy applications.
Okay, absolutely. Thank you so much. Well, it looks like we've hit all of our questions. Thanks to our audience for your participation. We really appreciate it. And at this point, I'll wrap things up on behalf of University Business. I'd like to thank both of our speakers here, Sam and Chris. Thank you both so much for sharing your time and expertise with us. We really appreciate you taking the time here today. And of course, to everyone in our audience, thank you as well for joining us. I do hope you found our presentation useful and informative to you. Producing webinars like this one is just part of our mission here at UB to inform college and university leaders like you about the latest news and trends in higher ed management. You'll find more coverage about issues such as the ones we discussed here in the pages of our print magazine, as well as on our website and digital edition, and in our various e-newsletters, which you can sign up for right from our website. And as I mentioned before, for those of you who would like to share the content of this webinar with your colleagues, anyone on your team, you can access it, the archive recording, at the URL on your screen here. And we'll also be sending out a follow-up email to everyone who registered or attended with links to where you can find the slides and the archive recording if you want to go back over it. So that is it for today's event. Once again, I'm Kurt Early for University Business. On behalf of our production team and everyone here at UB Magazine, goodbye, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Kurt. Really appreciate you having us.
Appreciate it, guys.